Dr. Bagula. I really appreciate that. And that was a very gracious introduction. So thank you. I would like to talk to you today about emancipatory equity education. And I will be talking on behalf of myself, as well as Dr. Bagula, because this is something that we've been working on in the last year. And you will be one of the first audiences to hear where we're taking this. I'd like to give you some idea of where the flow of this will go. And so it goes something like this. I'm going to do something by way of introduction to say who I am. Then we're going to talk about emancipatory leadership as a broader umbrella of where we're going with this. And then we're going to talk about what we mean by the terms emancipatory and equity in the context of this leadership theory or emerging theory. The way that this is going to work is it's going to be somewhat interactive. So I will, of course, be presenting content, but from time to time, I'm going to pause and ask you to ponder certain elements of what will be presented. And that will be most important when we get to what is called the Emancipatory Education Matrix. We're going to then do a pivot where all of this, in terms of the theme here, is to begin to look at equity and love together. And there's some ways that we've talked about love in terms of a course that I taught on love and leadership that I'll be bringing to this context. Then we're going to talk about the 7 C's and not the oceans, but ways to think about that love and how it can be brought into the classroom. And then finally, your care and commitment. In other words, how do you bring this forward? And so let me begin to talk about that in terms of where I started. About a couple decades ago, I was a high school English teacher, and I was working with students in what seemed to be a very progressive neighborhood. It was one of the first to have integration around race, and then I became a teacher in that school district. I was actually quite successful, president of my class and all that kind of stuff. But when I came back to teach, one of my first classes was a student that was students who were primarily African American males who were in their senior year. There was something that happened whereby these students had gotten to 12th grade where more than half of them could not write a coherent paragraph, but yet they were in 12th grade. And what I discovered is that the experience that I had and that others who looked just like me were having were dramatically different. So it really got me wondering what is going on here. And I didn't have the language of equity at the time. Fast forward to the last couple of years, I've been working with Fabiola and others, David Troutman and Makiba Jones, in a group called the RISE Urban Principal Preparation Program. What that program is about is really delving into these notions of equity. And we, with those students who are fantastic school leaders, then develop what were called participatory action research projects. And they examine things about how are we able to help young men have different conversations around relationships with women? How are we able to understand the challenges of retention that we are facing in our schools with our teachers of color? And these are just a couple examples of the kinds of projects that we're working on. So what I will invite us to be thinking about is then, what is your equity journey? And let's begin to explore that. And one way to explore that is by looking at just yesterday, where one of the words of Amanda Gorman, "The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." And so the invitation here is for us to be that light. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have a central inquiry, and the central inquiry for this goes something like this. What needs to be emancipated in education to ensure greater equity? And how do we become the light of equity as love in action. So I want you to ponder just that question. How do we become that light? And what is it that needs to be emancipated? So let's take this a little bit further. Emancipatory leadership, as I said, is the sort of overarching framework. And Bagula and Green, and we hope to have it published this year, have roots in this. And we want to give you some idea of where this comes from. So the whole notion of emancipatory leadership has some theoretical underpinnings, one of which is an adaptive leadership. By that, what we're attending to is that leadership that really only grapples with the technical aspects of how you attend to things, doesn't deal with the real repercussions or the challenges where we don't have easy answers. And Dr. Forbes-Berthoud talked to you about that yesterday. We also, of course, are borrowing from Freire in terms of the pedagogy of the oppressed and really attending to the voice that people have around their own liberation. We're looking at relational leadership theory, which is akin to much of what Margaret Wheatley talked about yesterday, but it really specifically talks to the common good in which we are operating. And then as of this moment, because of the executive order that just came out on racial equity, we can once now more talk about critical race theory, which is a way of then providing an opportunity for the deconstruction of systems of racism that influence behavior. And through that, what we're attending to is that the concept of emancipatory leadership is centrally around the answer to the problem is from the ones who are closest to the pain. In other words, what we really want to begin to do is engage those who are experiencing these issues in education and other contexts to be able to have their own voice and to bring their own efficacy. So I'm going to pause there for a second. Okay. Yes, because, hold on just a second. All right. So where do we want to take this? The way that we want to think about this is that critical race theory is just one element of this, but the roots of this are really in terms of the two words that are key to this, which are both emancipation as well as equity. So when we're talking about emancipatory education, what we're using is something from San Jose State, where it says it's about creating organizational cultures to reflect the diversity of experience and knowledge within school communities through collaborative approaches. The key word there is the collaborative element of this. And the other part that is key is about power systems, where we're challenging what is inequitable, and we're also trying to cultivate the wealth or the capacity that is already present. So what you can see in this is that what we're really attending to is that can we bring voice to circumstances and situations where usually there is a hierarchical or hegemonic approach that really attends to implicit ways of understanding and perpetuating the status quo. When we're talking about emancipatory education, what we're really talking about is a whole series of things. And you can see this list here, and I will highlight a couple of them. It isn't enough to only want to eradicate oppression. It also means that one is standing in opposition to that oppression. It also means, which we now, as of the executive order today, or then have permission once more to really inquire into difference so that we can begin to deconstruct the known narratives. The known narratives have been pitted against each other in terms of polarities. And as a consequence of that, we are not able to uncover and dismantle some of the dominance elements that show up. And then our challenge here is then how do we champion justice and equity so that we can really empower the persons of concern? And what I mean by persons of concern is that is usually the language of the disadvantaged or the victims. We're flipping that language borrowed from international work to really attend to the persons of concern are those who we want to have voice. because this is about transforming individuals, it's about transforming systems. Now let's take that to the next level. What we are beginning to look at here is that equity, we want to build a case for it. And the case, of course, is an acronym for it, and that means to challenge, to achieve, to support, and to expect. I want to start with the last one, which is expectation. When I was a high school teacher, I participated in a thing called teacher expectation and student achievement. And those of you who are of a certain age may remember it. And what it did in terms of my teaching at the time, it absolutely transformed it. It helped me to understand little things by the fact that when I stood in the front of the room, then that person that sat in the back right corner never had that experience of what it meant to be up front. And simply by walking to a different space in the room, I was changing the orientation of the classroom, and therefore allowing people who would not otherwise have that experience to have that experience. It helped me to understand that if I could attend enough to it, that were certain students for whom I had greater expectations than others. And that expectation became a self-fulfilling prophecy that showed up in how those students were evaluated. What I want us to think about is, in terms of equity, how do we then bring together that expectation to create conditions for high standards of excellence for all students, irrespective of their circumstance, while also concurrently doing the other pieces, which are, number one, to create a way that we challenge the barriers that are based on all of these elements of difference, so that we are working with students of concern, so that we are attending to how those variables, such as race, gender, neurodiversity, orientation, nationality, language, social economic status, citizenship status, and similar differences are affecting performance. How do we achieve the reduction in the gap so that while we focus on equal opportunities, we sometimes do not secure optimal outcomes? And then from that, how do we help the students learn in a manner that is consistent with and tailored to the social, historical realities that influence their school success? In other words, if we teach in a way that is disaggregated from those elements, then what we are doing is we're providing the opportunity, but we are not truly enhancing equity. Okay, that was fun. Okay, so rather than 3 R's, we're going to talk about 3 E's. So this is one of the first places I'm asking you to think about yourself. In terms of working in an emancipatory way, and in terms of working with equity, around the case for equity, where's your beginning point? For some of us, it is around the intellectual, the cognitive realm of this, where we are able to learn about the history of situations and circumstances. We're able to dig into the root causes. And for some of us, that sort of level of knowledge in that kind of way is really important. For others, is the social and emotional element. By that, what I mean is that some of us are really good in terms of knowing where we are, but there's also a real strong ability to relate to others and know where they are. The other level of this, at the same time, is also around the communal, which means the classroom, which means the school community. And some of us are really good about being transparent about policies, procedures, practices that are influencing things. And some of us are real advocates for what is called dialogic good, which is just a fancy way of saying, how do we invite voice into the process? Each of us has an entry point where we're strongest. For me, I like the intellectual part, I like the communal part, but the social emotional part is where I start. So if I were still in the classroom in a public education situation in the K-12, then I would be focusing on how do I start working on where I am. And then how do I then translate that in terms of the relationships with my students, with the parents, with my colleagues, with the administration? And then from there to cascade out to making sure that I continue to be educated about the history and to be cascading out to make sure that it is towards the good in a transparent way. So just take a moment, ask yourself, where are you? Where would you start in terms of these three E's: the intellectual, the social emotional, the communal? And you will note that there's no hierarchy in these. It is our entry point based on our best understanding of who we are and where we are at this moment. Now we're going to do another piece of work. We have the central inquiry in terms of what needs to be emancipated, but let's begin to take it to your context. So I would invite all of you to think about your particular context, be it as a superintendent, another administrator, a school leader, a classroom teacher, a board member, a researcher, a college professor. Wherever you are in all of these, begin to think about your context. And then I'm going to ask you two questions. And I want you to begin to grapple with, okay, I'm beginning to think about this intellectually or social emotionally or communally. Okay, I have that as a starting point. And I would ask you to note that in some way. Where is that starting point? Now answer this next question. In your context, what are the outcomes in education that are most in need of emancipation? In your context. At my son's school, what is most in need of emancipation right now is the digital divide, where there are certain students 10 months into this pandemic who have inadequate access to the technology necessary to be successful in school right now. That's just one example. And another part of that is that it is disproportionately affecting students of color. So if you look at your context, just examine it and ask yourself what most needs emancipation right now. The next question is like onto it. Where are there opportunities to advance education equity? Think about that question. Where are there opportunities to advance education equity? There's the very common cartoon or meme, if you will, where you have the children looking over the fence and the different boxes, and the boxes represent equity. And I like that one, but it often is critiqued because it really means that the children are still standing on the other side of the fence and truly not engaged in the game itself. There's another one that has been recently developed where there are two children. One is climbing the rungs of a ladder, and another one is climbing a ladder, but many of the rungs are broken or missing. When I think about equity in education, it is this latter image, where to recognize that the rungs of the ladder may be very different for different students. And so how do we look for those opportunities? Now, again, going to the school where I have a son right now, in recognizing the challenges around the digital divide, one of the adaptations that they use was to recognize that in-person education in small pods may be necessary. And in moments when the virus has been such that we've been able to do it, they have invited those students to come to school. And then they also adjusted the school calendar in such a way that those students would have opportunities for additional enrichment. You said, but that's not equal. No, it's not, but it is equitable. And therefore, there's an attempt to assure that those students have an opportunity to advance towards academic achievement in a way that they wouldn't otherwise, and perhaps have some social emotional needs met that would not otherwise be met. So I am asking you to take a moment right now and say, where are there opportunities to advance education equity? One thing to think about is that this sometimes all feels like a maze, because equity as love in action, as opposed to is love in action, the theme of this conference, is one that operates on many levels at the same time. So to make it much more of the idea that these are similes, then how do we begin to understand the different levels at which this may operate? And so I invite you to think about the micro levels. And again, this is interactive, and I want you to begin to think about your particular context and your particular way of understanding this. And of course, this is school, so we need to think about it in terms of ABCs. At the micro level, one of the ways to begin to bring equity to focus in a much more loving manner is to look at the attitudes, behaviors, and characteristics that we are bringing to the circumstance. When I talk about attitudes, I'm not just talking about my own attitude, my own behavior, my own characteristics. It is also an invitation to think about the other. The other could be a colleague. The other could be a parent. But most importantly, the other could be a student. And when we think about them as being other, then we abdicate our responsibility of creating a collective sense of that we are as one with them. So when we look at the micro level, that direct relationship, if we only think in terms of it being out there, then we're not looking at the part of ourselves that are engaged in it. The other part of it is that we may have certain elements of this that make it very difficult to address, because each of us, to some degree or another, have known patterns that we participate in on a regular basis. And without the support of others, then we tend to perpetuate those patterns, and they become practices. And these practices become so ingrained, so habitual, that elements of implicit bias and other more pernicious processes that undermine equity then begin to show up. In its more shadow way, they become our prejudices. I recently noticed myself grading a paper and found myself then really responding in a way where deeper, more shadow elements of my own prejudices, despite the fact that I do this work on a regular basis, almost on the daily basis, were showing up. The sort of shame and humiliation about noticing that could have blocked me from recognizing that if I notice it, then how do I begin to, on a micro level, address it? There are also predispositions, and the predispositions are often commonly a function of the narratives that we bring to a situation. The narratives that are chosen, the narratives that are known, the narratives that are implicit and continuous in how we function. And then that then leads to a sort of a prevalence of behaviors, because it is not just our behavior in these micro situations that affect the students. These are also things that then begin to permeate a system. And so that we become actors in it, where we are implicitly, using that word one more time, given permission to keep these micro aggressions present, which then undermines the equity that we're trying to create. So again, this is interactive, and I invite you to think about at the micro level, are there attitudes, behaviors, or characteristics that you find in yourself or that you see in others that are at play in your context? Then at the macro level, when we're beginning to deal with equity as love, then there are real responsibilities that we have around this. The reason I'm using the alliteration around P is that it is this notion of people, planet, profit, the sort of the triumvirate of those that is really going to be needed as we step into what the world is talking about. It isn't like capitalism is going to disappear in terms of its profit motive. But what is often left is the people element of this and the planet aspect of this. And so this thinking is wedded with that same sort of process. What we're talking about here is that there are policies, procedures, practices, and this is the practices that are at the macro level of systems. And there are platforms that then lead us and contribute to elements of inequity. What we will need here is then to figure out ways that how do we begin to allow ourselves to examine those policies, procedures, practices, and platforms. Now, platforms also means literally a platform like this. While we are able to engage this, I said just a moment ago, there are still students 10 months later who are not able to engage a platform like this or not able to do so consistently. This creates a challenge for us now and post-COVID in terms of parent engagement and pupil voice. In other words, how do we also make sure at the macro level, parent engagement, which we know is absolutely essential to student achievement, is something that is a focus. But now, as one of our Rise Up fellows did, how do you begin to invite pupils, those students, to begin to have voice in their own assessment, in their own learning, even as early as middle school? Okay. Now, this is where we really want to go. And so I want you to sort of stay with this. This is brand new. Fabiola hasn't even seen it yet, so here we go. The Emancipatory Equity Education Matrix will be, I hope, unless she puts it out of the chapter, is a way that we want to begin to think about how equity and emancipation are one process, but different faces of that process. This is a sort of a basic high and low sort of matrix. And so what I would like you to think about is that these words, performative, formative, reformative, and transformative, of course, I like the way they sound, but they also really do have meaning in terms of this. The performative level is that level where it is done because it looks good, the optics are great, and it basically puts a pause on anybody coming at you for it, okay? Formative is doing what we're supposed to be doing in terms of education. It is doing the curriculum, as we do it, and we're providing the equal opportunity. Okay. Now, as you all know, there's always the clarion call for reforming education. Reform really means using that which we have and trying to do it differently, which is different from transformative, which means that we may, from an adaptive leadership perspective, throughout the whole thing, and then find something new. And when we do that, that creates all kinds of anxiety in systems. You will notice at the right of this slide, there's this notion of status quo, and status quo is right in the middle. That which is below the line, performative and formative, are really ways to preserve the status quo. It allows us to do what we're doing right now, which is totally fine. But if we're looking at the high level of emancipation, high level of equity, then it really challenges the system. Reformative work is a challenge to the system. It really is attending to equity, but it may or may not truly challenge the status quo in the same kind of way. So you say, oh, I don't know if I believe all that. Well, I mean, that's theory, so you're allowed to question it. But let me try to fill it out, because here it is that, when I was in high school, and one of the reasons that I was so shocked by the class of students that I had of young men who looked like me, is that I was often presented as this kind of model student. And this is what can happen with African American students in our school. Now, that's fine for me, but what it was leaving out was the academic achievement gap that was perennial in my same school right next to me. And the optics of it were wonderful, but the realities were different. Those of us who are exceptional in making sure that our pedagogy is aligned with a standard curriculum, we're doing something that really can liberate certain students if they're able to walk into that process. But it does not necessarily address the differences in outcome, because we still know that in terms of English language learners, in terms of people who are of a neurodiversity, people who are mixed race, people who are African American, that the standard curriculum does not necessarily promote equity across all those populations. There's a lot that's been written about eliminating levels. That's really great in terms of reform, but does it really truly do the work of emancipation? It attends to some elements of this, but not all. And then there's holistic early childhood education, beginning with Head Start and now moving forward, where it also includes social emotional elements, where it includes really first 5 initiatives, things of that sort. That is a dramatic shift. And then if that is something that begins to be a model of what is done from birth to age 5, then what happens when that begins to be normative in elementary schools and middle schools and high schools? So I'm going to go back to the previous slide, and then I want you to fill out your version of this. You don't have to do it right now, but I would ask you to begin to think about it. At your particular school, in your particular setting, which of these is going on? Or if you can't say, oh, I can't deal with that. I said, well, then where is the center of gravity of your school? Is the center of gravity of your school more in the performative, formative, reformative, or transformative quadrant? That's the invitation. That's the wondering. Okay. Ooh, I felt the energy of the grumbling right there. That's the challenge. Okay. Now let's go forward. This is something that I borrowed from Equity in Education, what it is and why it matters. And this is an idea of ways that you can think about the chart that we just did. These are ways to design, practice, and resource different elements of this. And what you can see is there are a whole gamut of ways that we can begin to look at issues in equity. For example, in upper secondary education, provide attractive alternatives. In terms of resources, direct resources to the students with the greatest need. In terms of practice, strengthen the links between school and home to help students of concern learn in a different kind of way. If you look through these, you're likely to find 1 or 2 or different things that your school is already doing. And then how do we enhance those for greater equity? Now, all of this is how do we have liberation of learning and leading with love? And so as I sort of move to the closing of this, I want you to begin to think in terms of love. Love? Yes, love. And then I need to find my cursor. There it is. Okay. So equity as love in action is a wonderful theme on many levels. But then how do you begin to practice it? And how do you think about love? And love is such a complex construct. And as I said, I've taught a course on it because of its complexity. And one of the things that we do is that if we look from the Greeks, they had lots of ways of talking about love. And unfortunately, in Western context, too often love is reduced to the top eros, which means romantic or sexual love. Obviously, if that's the kind of love that we're talking about, then that has no place in the school context. You will notice at the bottom, there's another love that's called mania, which is the sort of obsessive love that we can have. But what I would invite you to think about is that as educators, we have a lot more range of love. So when we take those two out, then we have all of these different expressions of love that we can bring to equity in action. We are talking about agape, which is really this love of humanity. In terms of issues of climate change and the environment right now, that's a form of love. That's agape. In terms of philia, feeling a part of a team or a group, brotherly, sisterly love, given the history in recent years of polarity, the notion of helping students to begin to close those gaps and have conversations with each other is really important. In terms of storge, which is this family love, but storge isn't just the family love. It's that kind of feeling that you have with your best friend. But then how do you have that with your colleagues with whom you work? And how do you create the communal sense of that in your classroom? Ludus, which would be, from which ludicrous is derived, is how do you create fun? How do you create the opportunity so that people can see your excitement and so can see your passion about that? And then pragma is the notion that what we're doing isn't just for this moment, but is to be sustained, not just for this time, but this is sustained for time after time after time. And if you think about that teacher that influenced you, that invited you to want to be an educator. That's that being there, that being present. And then the notion of philatia, which is about really learning to love ourselves, to take care of ourselves, to really have the concern. And so all of us have an entry point in terms of love that we can then bring to equity. And so I invite you to think, where are you strongest? For me, I know that my strongest one is around the storge parts of it, where I can really begin to think about close relationships that are truly authentically close. And that allows me to learn and to nurture ideas with greater creativity and focus. And then what is beginning to happen as I begin to think about the nexus of social justice and environmental justice, then agape becomes much more about what I want. And then as I grow older, then the notion of legacy and pragma. So I would start with that kind of matrix for myself. But yours may be different. Yours may be a different starting point. And it doesn't require all of these. But to know that you have an entry place of love is key. So let's make this more concrete, sequential for some of it, for some of us. And that would be called the 7 C's. This is, with our flow, this is a way that we can begin to think about our journey differently. These words, care, creativity, connection, commitment, consciousness, community, and curiosity, I present it in this way because they really are like interconnected. This is truly something that is intersectional. It is a thing, but yet it is divided into these 7. Just as we talked about before with the love, is there a way that you can enter the sea, that you can begin to float into this journey that works for you? And so I'm going to give you it in the more linear sequential way. When we're talking about care, we go back to, Carl Rogers in terms of the unconditional positive regard and the empathy. Maybe that's your strength. Maybe your strength is connection both to the material, the content, the knowledge, but you also may have a strength in terms of connection to each other, to another person, and you are able to create those circumstances. The next one is in terms of creativity, that your strength is to figure out ways to bring something alive in the classroom, and so that the learning becomes powerful. Maybe for you, it's about curiosity. And what I mean by curiosity is that it isn't just the knowledge for knowledge's sake, but there's always this notion that learning is continuous, that there's this way that I want to know, and then you make that infectious for other people. Commitment, and that's a commitment to the learning of everyone. That means that you're really attending to that person over there, to that person that has neurodiversity, that you know is having a challenging time social emotionally, that is really doing very well and just wants that extra bit of encouragement and challenge. How do you attend to all of those folks at the same time? How do you, in your classroom, with your colleagues, on your school campus, in your community, and beyond, create this sense of oneness, of voice that goes beyond our polarities and divides? And most important for me is then how do we do this with continuous consciousness, so that equity, diversity, and inclusion are not just notions that are over here separate, but they are brought into this moment consistently. That is a part of our thinking on a regular basis. And so what I invite you to do right now is to think, just choose one of these for yourself. For me, it is care. But there's also the notion of commitment and consciousness. Those are my three, where it is really about trying to continuously be present in an empathic way, to really be invested in the learning of all, and to really begin to make sure that my consciousness is always on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So as I close here, remember that Amanda Gorman invited us into thinking about becoming the light. So the question is for you, in your school, what is one action that you can take? One way that you can bring this into action. And if I would go the right way, here we go. Here we go. And here's a final thought for you. This is the current beginning of our paper. As we analyze, criticize, propose, and strategize, let's never forget that we are part of a vast mutual liberation society. That as we work to free others, they are also working to free us. And with that, I thank you.